Lionel Messi is currently 30 years old, and in a piece published last week on uMAXit.com, Seb, you discuss the world post-Messi. In it, you suggest that we won't truly know the volume of the space that he occupies in the game until he steps away. But if you had to guess, what do you think the game will look like? And also I'm wondering if you think there'll be a levelling out effect in the instance that no one rivaling his ability comes along. So if we're not expecting to see someone quite as great as Messi for the next decade or so, do you think that we'll forget quite how good he was?
I don't think we'll forget how good he was, because I don't think traditionally that's actually what happens to great players. I think in the sort of the interim period after their retirement, there's a little bit of a kind of a moving on process. But then as the decades go by, the memory tends to get embellished. As for what the game will look like, it's very hard to say, because one of the features of Messi has always been, his excellence has always seemed very routine. There seems never to have been a time when you couldn't turn on to a Barcelona game and he wasn't in the middle of scoring a hat-trick. And over any length of time, that kind of ability, breeds complacency. And it ends up becoming rather mundane. I think it will just be rather an odd feeling. I think that Messi is a very universally appealing player, because there are very few people who like the game who would not enjoy watching him. In fact, it would be rather bizarre. I know there's that very strange, angry, binary situation between him and the fans of Barcelona and Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo's acolytes, which I've never really understood, to be honest. But generally speaking, he's he's one of those things that everybody, one of the players who everyone can enjoy, like a fireworks display. No one doesn't like that. It's like
I have to disagree, Seb.
You don't like fireworks.
It's interesting that you talk about consistency there, breeding complacency. I was thinking it's a shame that happens with footballers, but I suppose, if that didn't happen generally, we'd all be standing around staring at mobile phones and satellites with our mouths wide open, unable to believe it. So I suppose that's the nature of how we adapt to things. What I found interesting about the article was about how you describe Messi's importance to football, and you've touched on it there a little bit, talking about how consistent he was with hat-tricks and things like that. But also in the article, you quantify it in moments more generally, really, and you say it's highly likely, for instance, that within half an hour of watching a Barcelona game in which he's playing, the viewer will be rewarded with something, a goal, a turn, a defence scattering run, something which reminds them of sport at its finest, and in doing so stokes their love for it, which I think is actually a really accurate way of describing what makes a good footballer. And I'd never really thought about it in that way before, but I suppose it's, really it's entertainment value per pound that you're spending, really. And I guess that definitely, if you use that value or if you use that metric to kind of denote a player's value, then clearly Messi has to be the most entertaining player currently in the game, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think actually it's one of those things that goes right to the heart of sport, in that, one of the reasons, forget your tribal reasons for going to a stadium or, watching a game on television or, whatever sport that may be. I think sort of the essence of any sports fan's enthusiasm lies in the hope that they'll see something they've never seen before. I think, for instance, if you look back at sort of future greats across different sports, you tuned in to watch Usain Bolt run the 100 meters because you hoped he might beat the world record. It's the sort of the tease of something new. Same was probably true of Michael Jordan, Wayne Gretzky. These guys that transcend their sports. It's not just about domination. You don't want to watch Leo Messi just for the sake of watching him accumulate hat tricks. You might. I think there was. I forget which team it was against. I think it might have been Espanyol last season, where he slammed them between about 6 different players on the edge of the box within maybe about 2 square meters. It's an astonishing bit of skill. Sort of rapid zigzag, and it's that. It's not necessarily the game that you remember. It's not necessarily his literal effect on it or whether Barcelona won. It's that moment that lives on, and I think he more than anybody provides them. Certainly provides them more regular pace than anybody currently playing the game today.
That's also an interesting thing to consider about the modern world as well. Is that I suppose the aim of things like football or entertainment generally is to is to wow the crowd, I suppose. And you feel like with people who are alive today, it's much harder to impress people. It's much harder to shock people than it once would have, I guess, with the advent of the internet and with the number of what 50 years ago would have been incredible scientific achievements that happen every day. Now you sort of read about some, the atom being split in a newspaper, and you go, "Oh, that's cool," and then you move on to the next thing. So it really is quite astonishing that since we've been watching football for 100, 120, 130 years, and there's a player alive today who can still make the crowd go, "I can't believe he did that thing." I think that's really interesting. And also, I liked what you said about players transcending their sport, and you mentioned Michael Jordan there. What I think is really interesting about that is that it's arguable, really, that if you look at the sort of greats of the game today, LeBron James, Steph Curry, players like that, they're obviously fantastic at what they do, but they don't transcend the sport in the way that Michael Jordan did. And I don't think you could argue, really, that anyone currently playing basketball actually does that. So the requirement for transcending the sport isn't just being the best player around at the time. There's obviously something else that you need to have.
Yeah, well, I don't know enough about basketball to say that. What I do know is that the one guy that I always come back to who doesn't really get spoken about much these days is Bo Jackson. Younger listeners might not know who Bo Jackson is, but he was he actually simultaneously played baseball and American football for a while, and he was sort of the focus of this ubiquitous Nike advertising campaign. As Bo knows, you can see the advert on YouTube, I'm sure. He actually tries to play guitar with Bo Diddley during it, which is quite weird. Not a direction you see coming. I think he's a very good example of it, because Bo Jackson actually didn't achieve very much in total because he got hurt, and I think he destroyed his hip somehow. But you watched someone like that because he did things that you didn't think were possible. There was this huge hulking guy, but also one of the quickest players to ever play in the NFL. I mean, an extraordinary kind of spectacle, I think. And when that there aren't many parallels between Messi and Bo Jackson. It's a very cumbersome comparison. But I think one familiar trait that they share is that this idea that they could show you something that you haven't seen before, and I think that's really important. I think that's really important for sport. I think that's what retains people's enthusiasm for it. And
their innocence in some ways as well, because I think
a little bit, yeah.
You can have, I suppose, some of the most cynical people in the world, and I'm sure some of those people are at football games. And as you said, I
think a lot of those people are at football games.
If you see, Messi sidling between four players, and it's interesting with Messi particularly because that's something that we've seen before. He's not really doing anything specifically that we haven't seen before, but I think it's just the way that he does it, the grace with which he does it. I'm not really sure what it is.
I would say, well, yeah, the interesting thing about him is that he doesn't come replete with this sort of great array of tricks. He's not just a bundle of flick-flacks and roulettes. He just he's
more George Best than Neymar.
Well, I obviously I've only ever seen archive footage of George Best, so it's very difficult for me to answer that. But he seems to be one of those players that is just an example of how far you can go just by mastering the basic principles of the game: close control and awareness and touch and passing and shooting. Because rarely does he stray beyond those boundaries. Rarely does he do anything that you think, that belongs on a street football playground or in one of those cages, or he's not that kind of footballer. And I think I'll always gravitate towards that a little bit because it's bizarre as it seems to say it, it's a little bit more relatable.
Yeah.
You
can't do those tricks either.
Yeah, and not only can I not do them, I couldn't possibly foresee a situation in which I could, no matter what I did, no matter how long I spent with the ball, outside. It could never happen. And so I think there's a sort of, I I think there's a human quality at work there as well.
We should mention Cristiano Ronaldo, as you do in the article, in part to assuage people who might be reading it and being upset that he's not being mentioned. But
I don't understand those people. I mean, I'll let you finish your question, but those people, it's almost as if, to declare appreciation for one of these guys is inadvertently to say that you loathe the other. It's very strange.
Yeah, but I guess that's because it seems to me that most people, or certainly most people that would have that conversation, also like to pick a side, which is obviously completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
But I note from the article that you feel that his departure won't quite have the same effect on the sport as a whole as Messi's, and I wondered if you could explain that.
I think. Well, first of all, look, I've seen Cristiano Ronaldo play in real life, and he's obviously among the very best players I've ever seen, and that was actually before he reached what I would probably consider to be his peak. So, there's no question about his footballing value, and obviously he rightfully shares a stage with Messi. What I meant was that he's a more antagonistic character, just on the field of play. Forget who they are as people. I think Ronaldo, the footballer, is a slightly more three-dimensional character in the sense that his facial expressions, his body language, the actual way in which he plays the game. I think lately you'd also include the perception of his relationships with teammates. Certainly, the whole world is aware of what a Gareth Bale goal will do to his expression. For instance, there is, whether true or not, the perception is that you're dealing with an astronomical ego, and I think it's the game will miss Ronaldo, the footballer, because how could you not? He's a fabulous player. But I think the residual resentment that exists around him will kind of soften that. I think Messi, as a result, Messi is a sort of, we have no idea what these people are like as actual people. All you can do is judge them on their playing personalities. And I think Messi comes across as the more benevolent of the two by quite some distance. Ronaldo, you will miss his goals, you will miss his free kicks, and you will miss. He's very much a sort of a headlining act, isn't he? He is a reason to buy a ticket. However, you can understand why some people will, not miss him being there anymore.
Yeah, and I think it's
and he likes a dive. Let's be honest.
Let's balancing it out. I have seen Lionel Messi dive as well.
I've seen it too. I think that it's something you associate more with Ronaldo.
Yes.
And I think that if people wanted to make that case, they could quite easily say that they will survive a football world without him being in it.
I think the evidence is probably out there for that.
It's not a commentary on what he is as a player, because who hasn't enjoyed what he's achieved, not what it's meant in terms of what it's allowed Real Madrid, Manchester United to do, but just seeing someone that has been that dominant over that period of time is a real privilege.
I think it's interesting that we talked before about Messi not really having an ego that's as inflated, but that does translate into different players on the pitch. I often think back to when Ronaldo played for Manchester United and scored that 45-yard goal against Porto in the Champions League.
Yeah, it's an astonishing goal. Yeah.
I just think, the keeper wasn't even that far off of his line, and I just think, the level of ego that you need that's required to even try that. I think this is the sort of thing that Lionel Messi never would have tried, and that's to his credit as well. But, they really are chalk and cheese, and you get totally different entertainment value out of watching Ronaldo. I think he's much more part of the soap opera than Messi is.
I think so. And look, one of the things I didn't put into the article just for the sake of time was that this isn't necessarily a true reflection or an accurate reflection of either, because actually one of the misunderstood notions about Ronaldo is that he is an egotist on and off the pitch, whereas in reality he's someone that has paid for a lot of children's surgeries, and he's come from very humble beginnings and is, by all accounts, extremely good to his family and people close to his family. And look, we talk about Messi as an egoless character. Well, it's not really true. He's a very strong dressing room presence at Barcelona, and obviously we're not going to mention it specifically for libel reasons, but there are issues about his tax, and we're not trying to present him as a saint, and Ronaldo as his sort of his opposite.
Whereas football does really, and that's interesting that
football tries to. Though,
well, they exist in the same era, and you have to really sort of go back quite far to a point where you find two players who might possibly exist in the sort of top 5 best footballers of all time, existing so close to one another. They're almost like one requires the other to exist. I wonder what their makeup would be if it weren't for the other. Would Ronaldo be seen as the antagonist? Would Messi be sort of seen as the angelic boy?
I think it's one of those things, isn't it? I mean, you get two players of equatable ability who happen to also play for Real Madrid and Barcelona, and inevitably this binary relationship is gonna spring up around them, and that's a shame. But because it has created what we mentioned earlier, this sort of perception that you must pick a lane with one of these guys, that you cannot just appreciate what they are, and that is a shame. But
I think in some ways as well, Messi is a bit more of an enigma, because I've thought before with Ronaldo that he's quite similar to someone like Ibrahimovic in that. Mm-hmm. I think getting that good at football and practicing that much, and we already talked about his ego and his confidence and stuff, it requires so much from a person to reach the level that he's at, that he's obviously going to have put a lot of himself into it, and perhaps as a sort of defence mechanism he's developed this public persona as being a bit of an egotist, and I think Ibrahimovic is the same. You wonder whether a player needs something like that in their arsenal to just to reach where they are, whereas Messi doesn't seem to have that in the same way. And also, the other thing to say about him is that he doesn't really seem on brand in a way that other players are. I think even someone like Neymar, he seems to have a character or an identity separate to that of their reality. Messi, as you said, doesn't really try the tricks, doesn't really have a public persona in the same way that the other top players do. And I wonder if he's an enigma there, or if maybe he's a dying breed of a relic of a time sort of pre advertising and football having such a close relationship.
I don't know. I mean, the only thing I'd suggest is that obviously, of all of those players, only one of them has come through, the most famous football academy in the world. And actually, there's an excellent Graham Hunter book about not about Messi, but about the rise of modern Barcelona. Well, actually, not modern Barcelona, not what they are currently, but what they were, what they grew to be under Rijkaard, under Guardiola, and Tito Villanova. And there's a couple of chapters which deal with Messi's time in La Masia, alongside Cesc Fabregas and Gerard Piqué. And the character portrayed is actually very shy. I mean, by all accounts, I think Fabregas and Piqué thought that for the first year or so that Messi was actually a mute, because he just wouldn't speak. Obviously part of that has to do with him, him being Argentinian and him being in a foreign country which he didn't necessarily feel at home in and away from his family. But also, I think that some of that reticence seems to be in his personality today. Certainly his playing personality. It's there isn't that kind of self-glorification DNA that you see in some other players, and that you see in players who are not even close to being his equal. To be fair, obviously Neymar and Ibrahimovic, those are all players that belong in roughly the same category. But I think it's a very seductive mix.
You could argue that to add another name to the list, I know he's not having the best season at the moment, but Gareth Bale has a sort of quiet power in a similar way.
No, I wouldn't put Bale anywhere close. I mean, Bale is a great player, and I saw him do some wonderful things at Tottenham. But I think Bale is an example of someone who's just a bit socially awkward. I
think if he had more social skills, he'd be more of a bastard.
Yeah, well, I maybe. I mean, I just think he is quite an awkward personality. If you listen to him interviewed and hear him speak, he doesn't really fit the superstar costume. He's tried very hard. For instance, look at his haircut, and look at the way he carries himself. He desperately wants to fill that kind of. I'm guessing desperately wants to fill the sort of the Beckham void. the transcendent superstar, and it just doesn't work because Gareth Bale just looks like a normal bloke. Just
on him. Just for a second, let's detour further into Bale land. You've followed Spurs for a long time, so I'm interested to hear what you think of him. Not specifically his achievements at the moment, but personally, I think it would be nice to watch him more often. And since I don't watch La Liga, I'd quite like him to come back to a Premier League club. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I don't think I'd want to see it. I don't think I'd even want him back at Tottenham because I think there's the memory of what he left is very pure because certainly in Tottenham's history, there are very few instances where a player has been that dominant. Because there were times when we'd watch him and you'd see him, Gareth Bale doesn't actually have a big range of tricks. He's an amazing athlete. And he's got incredible sort of 5-yard acceleration and he's able to sustain that acceleration over long periods of long distances, and it's all very impressive. And there were times when we'd watch him and you'd think, exactly what he's about to do. The opponent knows exactly what he's going to do, and yet they still can't stop him.
Which is cut inside and shoot with your left from miles away.
If you go back onto YouTube and you find like a compilation of his goals, you'll see sort of this. Particularly the last few. There's one. The last goal he scored was I want to say it was against Sunderland at White Hart Lane, and there was one a few weeks earlier against Southampton, and the two left backs he's facing, and in pretty much the same place on the pitch, the right channel. They know what he's doing, and they'll have been told by everybody inside them, show him down the touchline, show him down the touchline, show him down the touchline. And it's about 30 yards from goal on both occasions. I think it's Southampton's Luke Shaw, and I forget who the Sunderland fullback was. But in each case, Bale just goes past him. And even though they have compensated and made sure that is absolutely what he can't do. And it's a very rare place for a footballer to be when you are that dominant. So I have all the admiration in the world for what Bale did at Tottenham. And I'm not one of those Tottenham supporters who disliked what happened next, because the moment he scored the Inter Milan hat-trick, he was leaving the club. It was just a question of where. It was just, that's where Tottenham were at the moment, and he was heading to somewhere far different. Maybe under today's conditions, under Pochettino and where Tottenham are, maybe that's slightly different, but I don't know. I think, I don't know. I mean, I think he's a very hard player to categorise in terms of English football history, because he didn't actually win anything in England. And so it's very difficult to make a case for him just on the basis of, he had an entire team built around him, which, again, not a privilege a lot of players get, particularly not at big clubs. You very rarely, for instance, get a Manchester United player who is the focus of everything a team does, whereas Bale, under Villas-Boas, he was Tottenham. The entire game plan was designed around getting him into one-on-one situations and allowing him the opportunity to hurt an opponent. And so you could probably claim that what he produced was a slightly false economy. I don't know. I think Bale, I think, maybe is someone in 5 years' time to look back on and see where he places. I don't know what he is in relation to the rest of his generation yet.
So I mean, I suppose that describes what you would like or not like to happen. What do you think he'll do? Because there always seems to be speculation every summer.
Yeah, I think eventually Real Madrid, maybe within a season or two. I mean, the noise. The thing you've always got to consider with Real Madrid is the politics, and more than clubs in England, what people say, what the media say, what the supporters think, it matters, because re-election for presidents.
So selling one of your air quotes best players is never a positive thing. And
I don't think it is. But eventually, because Bale is not a Ronaldo or a Messi, he is replaceable. There will be somebody else who, appears in his place within a year or two. You could probably make that argument now. You might say that it's slightly strange under different circumstances. Real Madrid could have competed with Barcelona for Ousmane Dembele. I mean, it's an easy So I'd imagine he would leave before much longer, and purely on the basis that Premier League clubs have a greater financial reach than any other league in the world. England's obviously a high percentage destination. What I will say in that is that there's an interesting detail that one of the conditions of his sale to Real Madrid was which was sort of inserted to the agreement by Daniel Levy, was that if they ever sold him, Tottenham would have the opportunity to match the fee. So there's this potential. There are still Tottenham fans. There were Tottenham fans this transfer window who thought that Tottenham's inertia in the transfer market was about this big Bale, plot twist on the final day.
The homecoming.
They need to maybe have a little read up on what the club's wage structure is. But yeah, so I'm sure we'll see him back in England at some point. I don't think you'll see him ever when he comes back as a player in his late 20s. He's not going to be what he was.
That's a shame.
It is a shame.
It feels in some ways like we've sort of missed 2 or 3 years of what could have been if he hadn't have gone there.
Well, we have done, but also Bale struggled with injuries a lot, as you'd expect from a player who plays with his intensity and he runs the kind of distances that he does. His body has started to break down. He's had back trouble. He's had muscle problems in the top of his thighs. He's not going to be. I would say that his peak has already passed. He was
a bright burning candle.
Hey, wonderful player. But, yeah.
One final question. What I was thinking about the difference between the top players today and the top players in the past, and not in a way of trying to compare them on the pitch, but more of how they are valued by the clubs, by the sport, and also how they're looked after, really. And I was thinking about George Best as a good example of this. When George Best was alive, he was at times arguably, if not the best footballer in the world, then certainly one of the best footballers in the world. And he had various personal problems, and he had alcohol addiction, and he was really kind of just allowed to wander off into that and lose what might have been. And I wonder if that could ever, I suppose in very, very extreme examples, of course, but I wonder really if that could ever happen today with a player like Messi, the way that they're valued by the club, the way that they are very likely looked after by the club. Do you think we're past the days where they're, people allowed to do their own thing, perhaps where they're more commodities and insured to the highest degree?
Yeah, I mean, you never want to be complacent about that kind of thing. And assume that sort of, public, not breakdowns, but emotional difficulties are a thing of the past. I think one of the overlooked issues here is that if George Best was to play now, he would be to an extent inhibited by his own visibility. I mean, he was extremely famous during his career, of course, but he wasn't extremely famous during a social media age, a total information age, sort of amateur journalists ultimately everywhere. George Best now couldn't sit down in a pub, if he was a 25-year-old footballer,
which he did every day.
And very sadly he did every day. And also I think that, as much as anything else, Best was probably a victim of the culture culture of his profession. I mean, even as recently as the 90s, English football had a huge drinking culture. And it was kind of accepted. Whereas now I think that rather than if you're a member of the public sitting in your local pub and a group of footballers came in and sat there for the entire afternoon necking pints, that would look quite bizarre in a way that it probably didn't 20 years ago. You'd be like, the boys are just bonding, bit of team building, nothing wrong with that. Whereas now you think, well, you got a game in 4 days. It's just because we know differently, and also yes, I mean there would obviously be an army of representatives and PR handlers around someone of Best profile now, and the almost every top club has a forest of structures which are designed to manage that kind of situation, or better, to prevent it happening in the first place. I think it's a very I don't know. I'm not. I don't know enough about the causes of this kind of thing to really comment. But I mean, it just logically, it doesn't seem like it could happen again.
No, and I think as well with George Best as the example, in a way, it's a slightly odd one, because really he was, one of the first to experience what you could argue as the modern day experience for a footballer in terms of being part of advertising campaigns and being a face for branding, and he really paved the way for David Beckham, who took that to the next step, But I think at the time it was obviously fledgling ground for footballers. Now it's a much more established route, and I think that I suppose the people who are benefiting from that recognise that keeping the player healthy and put it frankly, alive for longer means that they're more likely to get more value out of it. But I think the thing that I watched a couple of documentaries about George Best recently, and I think the thing that upset me most about it was the idea that he was just kind of used and disposed, and there were plenty of people around him who were making an awful lot of money out of him, and there was very, very little regard, if any, for the player himself. I wonder if that's the same now, or whether, as we say, those sort of safeguardings around this kind of practice is going to make sure that doesn't go to the extremes that it did. But
I wonder though. I mean, the person I always compare him with, not least because they existed at roughly the same time, is probably Joe Namath, the New York Jets quarterback from the 60s. I mean, you could make very similar arguments about the way they lived their life. Namath, superficially at least, looked to be someone who cared as much about women and socializing and advertising revenue more than he probably did about playing. That's a perception, not a definitive judgment. And Namath later on in his life did have problems with his alcohol, but was still able to play his career and function in a way and leave a legacy which was longer, but also purer in a sporting sense than Best. I think it's very easy in hindsight to sort of to when something like that happens to an individual, to take aim at the people that existed around him or her, and say that you were just a hanger-on. You should have recognised this, and you should have recognised that. I don't know. I don't know if we can make that kind of judgment. With the hindsight that we've benefited from in the sort of the 30, 40 years since, because we know a lot more about this stuff. I mean, you remember also that as recently as 1996, Tony Adams was immediately after Euro 96, Tony Adams went on like a 4-day bender or something, and what it took his own sort of emotional breakdown to kind of penetrate that. There weren't people around him saying, he'd been to prison by this point. So it's there are a lot of factors, and there are a lot of instances in which someone, a friend, a relative, a teammate could have jumped in and tried to intervene, but no one did. And so I think that the responsibility is ultimately the individuals. And I don't know enough about George Best to say it with too much confidence, but I always feel as if that kind of scenario is the consequence of the individual's personality itself.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and also you're right that it's difficult to judge these situations with retrospect.
With today's knowledge, I mean, it's because we know so much more, and there are so many more examples of what can be done to help people and what can be done to treat them, and there are also all these caveats about what happens to someone if it's not treated or if it's not, if there's no intervention. And I don't know. It's a very hard thing. Assigning blame for that kind of situation is almost impossible, I think.
And I guess the reason that I feel so strongly about it, or that people feel strongly about it, is often because these footballers were originally kids who were, often leaving their family from an earlier age than kids might normally do, who were put in, the hands of other people who really, could have, I suppose, been more responsible. As you say, it's very, very difficult to.
And they skip their childhood and they're given a lot of money, and sometimes that leads to bad things. Of course, it does. But yeah, I mean, I think it's going to sound terribly callous, this, but I think someone like George Best was take the personal tragedy away from it. I think that was a lesson maybe the world needed to learn about what can happen to someone without the right care. But also what the warning signs are for someone,
Well, look at Gaza. I mean, the world didn't learn it.
Well, I don't know. I don't think that I wouldn't necessarily compare Best and Gascoigne. I think Gascoigne was, I don't know. The more I learn about his childhood and some of the things he saw in his childhood, yes, I agree. There are some similarities, and the overexposure was not good for him whatsoever. Of course it wasn't. But I think you were dealing with someone that needed to be in a psychiatrist chair.
Don't we all?
Well, in that voice, yes, you do. But Gascoigne, that is a tragedy. But again, I'd also say that was a tragedy. Very easy to blame the press, and the press have done some dreadful things to him. They really have. But I think his fragilities were his responsibility. Or not his responsibility, but the responsibility of people around him. Mm-hmm. The world, very, very difficult, very tough. I mean, we still don't, even now, 2017, we still don't really know enough to have a definitive opinion. But I don't know. Always criticising the media for the way they handle people and for the way that they kind of multiply these situations. I think it's a little bit of a soft option.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, that's very depressing. So I'm going to ask you a final question,
final question.
Yeah,
maybe.
I don't have to cry when we finish.
Yeah,
this.
Okay.
It's also a question that you can't possibly ever answer. So I want to bring it back now to football's angelic boy, Lionel Messi. I know it's impossible to compare players from different eras, but go on, give it a go.
Okay, you know why it's impossible to compare it to players from different eras?
Please tell us.
Because we haven't had the benefit of watching, Diego Maradona or Pele over 90-minute games, or very few of us have, or at least you just, the volume of football is so different now to what it was. You can't.
And also the style of football, the pace of football, the athleticism, all of that. I mean, if you drop Diego Maradona into today's game, it might be a slightly different story. Vice versa.
Well, also maybe if you expose Diego Maradona to modern conditioning imperatives, and you gave him a lighter weight boot, you just don't know. It's just.
Hey, if I was at peak physical condition, I'm pretty sure I'd be a world beater. So. These are all hypotheticals.
I've met you in real life, and I have to disagree. I don't think that was ever your path in life. I'm going to sit on the fence there. No, I just don't agree with it. In the same way that I don't agree with people that whatever happens in the contemporary world, they will always retain loyalty to some whoever in the past. That's kind of things are always better in my day syndrome, and I don't believe it. I don't. Also, I don't really see the necessity in classifying players across generations, because why? Who cares? It's
I guess humans care without being too deep about it. I think we all like to categorize things, and it helps us understand the world.
Yeah, but it's like saying what was your favorite Apollo mission? But how can you compare them? Because each time they went up, they knew a little bit more. They were better prepared. They were able to achieve more. It's silly. So no, I'm not going to answer your question.
Before we finish, one final thing. We are launching the new website on the 1st of November. Tifo. Seb, would you like to add anything? You are the content editor. Would you want to tell people a little bit more about what we're doing on the uMAXit site now, what's going to be happening on the Tifo site from an editorial perspective?
Yeah, so originally when uMAXit was launched, it was never intended to grow into what it now is, with sort of editorial arms and YouTube arms, and it'll do all these things. And so it was decided that by our wonderful benefactor Neil, that we need an upgrade, and it's been going on for like 3 or 4 months, and we think that we've built something which reflects where the site is, and the sort of the quality of output that is coming through it. Certainly, I think the way I phrase it, Joe, is that it's sort of, we're bringing the kind of the superficial details up to a standard that matches the work that's going into it.
We're making it sexy.
We are indeed. Yeah. Really, really, really are.
And also we're going to be adding a couple of different categories, like interviews and reviews and stuff that wasn't on the uMAXit site as well. So that's going to be fun for us.
Yeah, I think so. And it's definitely something to look forward to. And hopefully everyone enjoys it.
All right, Seb, thanks very much, man. We'll speak to you again the next couple of months.
Okay, mate.